I need to check the list of used names first, then write the story. The names to avoid are all in the uploaded file. Let me write a completely new story with fresh names. May I have your attention for just a moment? Because what I'm about to tell you happened at my own anniversary dinner in front of 240 people who had known me for decades. And the person who humiliated my wife of 38 years was sitting right beside her when she did it. Let me take you back to that evening. It was a Saturday in April, the kind of evening you spend months planning. The venue booked 9 months in advance, the flowers coordinated with the tablecloths, the band my wife had loved since our first dance together in 1988. The Harrington Grand Ballroom in downtown Charlotte, private event, full floor, chandelier lighting. I had paid for every detail myself because I wanted my wife, Josephine, Jo. I've always called her to feel what she deserved to feel on our 38th anniversary. Seen, celebrated, surrounded by everyone who loved her. What I didn't plan for was my daughter-in-law standing up in front of all of them and making the night about herself. Her name is Sloane. She married my son Everett 4 years ago. I'll get to Sloane. I need to get to Sloane eventually because understanding what happened that night requires understanding what kind of woman she is. But first I need to tell you something about myself that I'm not particularly proud of. I was not a perfect father. I built my company from a single truck and the hand-painted sign on the side of a highway in 1986. By the time Everett was born, we were comfortable. By the time he turned 10, we were more than comfortable. I gave him everything I didn't have growing up, and I told myself that was love. I told myself I was doing it right. I wasn't. I was giving him the one thing that would make his life harder in ways I couldn't see yet. A complete absence of struggle. No reason to try. No muscle built from effort. Just a soft life handed over with both hands by a father who confused providing with parenting. I'm telling you this because the man with the most likes on my last video, some commenter I'll never meet, got it exactly right. Parents bear responsibility too. I accept that. What happened at my anniversary party didn't come from nowhere. It came from 30 years of me writing a check whenever my son needed one. Everett is 31 now. He works in commercial real estate. Or rather, he holds the title. I helped him get the license, helped him build the client list, introduced him to every contact I had in the Charlotte market. He does well enough on paper, but Everett has never truly worked for anything in the way I understand work. He has never stared at a number that didn't add up and felt the cold sweat of not knowing how to fix it. I made sure of that. Sloane understood this about my son before I did. She came from money herself, old rally money. The kind that has a family name on a hospital wing. She was 30 when they met, sharp as a blade, beautiful in that calculated way that made you feel slightly off balance when she smiled at you. I noticed it at our first dinner together. Jo noticed it too, though she said nothing to me until much later. Jo has always been more perceptive than me about people. I see what's in front of me. She sees what's underneath. The wedding was fine. Sloane was gracious enough. She called me Dad at the reception, which I thought was warm until I realized she only did it in front of people who might notice. Alone with me, or with Jo, she was always slightly formal. Polite in the way that keeps you at a distance without giving you anything to point to. Jo came home from one of their lunches in the first year of the marriage and said quietly, "She's measuring something, that one." I told her she was reading into it. I was wrong. Over the next 3 years, small things accumulated. Everett stopped coming to Sunday dinners alone. Sloane always came, and when she came, the tone shifted. She corrected my son at the table, gently, always gently, in a way that made it look like affection while making him look like a child. She redirected conversations away from Jo. Not rudely, just consistently. A pivot here, a change of subject there. Jo would start a story, and Sloane would smile and ask me about business, and somehow the story never got finished. Jo started saying less when Sloane was around. My wife, who had raised our son, who had a master's degree in education and had spent 20 years in a classroom before she retired, who could hold a dinner table for 3 hours with nothing but her voice and a good bottle of wine. My wife started going quiet at her own kitchen table. I noticed. I said nothing. That is one of my great regrets. Then came the anniversary dinner. 240 people. Family, old friends, business partners. I'd worked beside for 30 years. Neighbors who'd watched Everett grow up. Jill wore the dress she'd found in a boutique in Asheville. Deep blue, the color of the ocean at night, which she said was exactly where she wanted to be when she wore it. She looked extraordinary. I told her that in the car on the way there, and she laughed and said, "After 38 years, you're still going to make me blush." That's the memory I return to when the rest of that evening gets too heavy. The dinner went well for the first 2 hours. The speeches from our friends were warm. My oldest friend, a man I've known since we were 19 and working the same construction site in the summer of 1983, stood up and told a story about a terrible camping trip that had everyone laughing so hard. 2 women at the front table had to put their glasses down. Joe's sister flew in from Oregon. My brother drove from Savannah. It was everything I had wanted it to be. Then Everett stood up. I expected a toast. I was ready to feel proud of my son. I was ready to see him raise a glass to his mother and say the kind of things a son says when he loves his parents and knows he's been given more than most. He said perhaps 4 sentences. Adequate, not unkind, brief, and then sat down quickly. Too quickly. Sloane put her hand on his arm the moment he sat down, not affectionately, like she was settling him. And then she stood up herself. I thought she was adding to the toast. She thanked everyone for coming. She said what a beautiful evening it was. She said how moved she was to be part of this family. And then she reached into the small clutch on her chair and took out a folded document and said, very clearly, in her calm, measured voice that never raised itself for anyone, "I hope you'll all forgive me for being practical on such a romantic occasion, but I think it's time we talked about the future of this family's financial security." The room went very quiet. I looked at Joe. Joe was looking at Sloane with an expression I had never seen on my wife before. Not anger. Something past anger. A kind of tired recognition that said, "There it is," Sloane explained, to 240 people at my anniversary dinner over the remains of a meal I had paid $40,000 to serve them. That I was 63 years old. That my company held assets which would eventually transfer to my estate, and that she and Everett had worked with their own attorney to draft a formal proposal for restructuring those assets into a family trust. Immediately. With Everett named as the managing trustee. She said it was for my protection. She said she was doing this because she loved our family. She slid the document across the table toward me. I looked at it. I looked at my son. Everett was staring at the centerpiece. He had the look of a man who had agreed to something in private that looked very different in public. I picked up the document. I read the first page. Then I set it down, folded it along its original crease, and pushed it back across the table toward her. I said, "Thank you, Sloane." That was all. She blinked. She had expected something else. Protest, perhaps, or flustered anger. The reaction of a man caught off guard. She had not expected quiet. People who perform in public are always undone by quiet. I turned to the room and said that I appreciated my daughter-in-law's concern for our family's future, and that I had in fact been planning ahead for some time. I asked if everyone would be kind enough to enjoy their dessert while I stepped out briefly to make a phone call. I was gone for 7 minutes. When I came back, I sat beside Joe, took her hand under the table, and squeezed it twice. That was our old signal, from when the kids were small, and we needed to say something to each other across a crowded room without words. I have handled it. She squeezed back once. "I trust you." The band started playing again. The evening continued. Sloane spent the rest of the night watching me. Let me tell you what happened in those 7 minutes. I want to be honest with you, I was not surprised. Not entirely. 3 weeks before the anniversary, my personal attorney, a man named Prescott, who has handled my business affairs for 19 years and who I trust more than almost anyone, called me into his office for what I assumed was a routine review. Instead, he showed me a letter that had arrived at his office from an attorney in Raleigh. The letter was inquiring, on behalf of an unnamed client, about the process for contesting a business asset transfer. Prescott said to me, "Do you know anyone in Raleigh who might have an interest in your assets?" I thought about it for longer than I should have needed to. "My daughter-in-law grew up in Raleigh," I said. We sat with that for a moment. Then Prescott said, "Would you like me to update your documents?" "Yes," I said, "all of them." We spent 4 hours that afternoon reviewing everything. My will, the business succession plan, the property deeds, the investment accounts. By the time we were done, there was not a single document with Everett's name on it in any capacity that granted immediate access to anything. A trust had been established, irrevocable, with Prescott as the independent trustee, with provisions for Everett that required specific conditions to be met over time. If he chose to meet them, he would eventually inherit his share. If he didn't, it would go to organizations I had spent years supporting. There was nothing for Sloan. There had never been anything for Sloan. But now, it was in writing in a way that couldn't be unwound at an anniversary dinner. That was the phone call I made. I called Prescott to confirm that everything had been filed and recorded 3 days prior as planned. He confirmed it. He also mentioned, calmly, that he had already received a message from the Raleigh attorney asking about timeline. He had responded that all relevant documents were now a matter of public record. I thanked him and went back inside. The morning after the anniversary, Everett came to the house alone. Sloan did not come with him. That told me everything I needed to know about which of them had understood first. He looked the way my son used to look when he was 8 years old and had broken something he knew couldn't be fixed. A particular kind of shame that comes not from the act itself, but from being seen committing it. He stood in my kitchen with his hands in his pockets and he said, "I'm sorry, Dad." I poured him a cup of coffee and set it on the counter. "Sit down," I said. He sat. We were quiet for a while. Outside the window, Jo was in the garden with her coffee, the way she always is on Sunday mornings. She hadn't told me to go easy on him. She hadn't told me to be hard on him. She had kissed me on the cheek before I came downstairs, and that was it. How long had she been planning that? I asked. He didn't answer immediately. Then, about a year. And you knew. He stared at the counter. She said it was practical. She said you'd understand. She said, Everetter. He stopped. I'm not asking what she said, I'm asking what you knew. He was quiet for a long time. I knew, he said. That was the moment, right there. Not the anniversary party, not Sloane's speech, not the document slid across the table. That word, knew, was the thing that actually broke something between us. Because he had known, and he had let his mother sit at her own anniversary dinner while his wife stood up in front of 240 people and tried to take what wasn't hers. And he had sat there and stared at the centerpiece. I told him I needed him to understand something. I told him that everything I had built over 40 years had been built by a man who started with nothing, who had driven that first truck himself, who had spent a winter bidding on jobs that barely covered gas money while his wife worked double shifts as a teacher's aide, because we had a baby and the rent was due, and I hadn't yet figured out how to make the business breathe on its own. I told him that I had made the mistake of protecting him from all of that I had thought I was giving him a better life, when what I was actually giving him was the inability to build one for himself. I told him that I had loved him in a way that had not served him. I told him that was going to change. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten him. I didn't run through the details of what Prescott had documented, or explain the trust, or walk him through what he stood to lose. That wasn't the conversation I needed to have. The financial consequences would arrive without my commentary. What I needed him to understand, what I needed to say out loud, perhaps as much for myself as for him, was that the man sitting across from him at that kitchen table was not angry. He was grieving, because I had spent 31 years trying to give my son a good life. And somewhere between the first truck and the Harrington Grand Ballroom, I had given him someone else's life instead, a life without consequence, without effort, without the particular dignity that comes from building something yourself. And now he was sitting in my kitchen looking like a man who did not know what he was made of because I had never let him find out. He cried. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. My son, 31 years old, sat at my kitchen counter and cried, and I let him, and I put my hand on the back of his neck the way I used to when he was small and had a nightmare, and I didn't say anything until he was done. Then I said, You have a decision to make. He looked at me. The marriage is yours. I won't tell you what to do with it. But I will tell you this. You will not spend the next 30 years being managed by anyone. Not me, not your mother, not your wife. That ends now. You figure out who you are without a check from me, and then you decide what you want your life to look like. I slid a piece of paper across the counter. Not a legal document, just a note, handwritten, with the name and address of a contractor in Mooresville who owed me a favor from a project 8 years ago. The man ran a small crew, good work, honest pay. I had already called him. He'll start you Monday if you want, I said. Physical work, real hours, real pay that you earn yourself. Everett looked at the paper for a long time. Then he folded it and put it in his shirt pocket. He left without another word, and I stood at the window and watched him back out of the driveway. Jo came in from the garden with her empty coffee cup and looked at the 2 cups on the counter and at my face and said nothing, just came and stood beside me and put her hand through my arm. Is he going to be all right? She asked. I don't know, I said, but I think he has a better chance now than he did yesterday. I'll tell you what happened with Sloan. A week after the anniversary, Prescott sent a formal letter to her attorney in Raleigh, brief, professional, simply confirming what had been filed and noting that any further inquiries regarding my estate should be directed to his office. No threat, no aggression. Just the quiet click of a door closing. Her attorney's response came 10 days later. It was 4 sentences. They had reviewed the documents. Everything appeared to be in order. They wished the family well. That was the last I heard from the Raleigh attorney. What happened between Everett and Sloan is between them, and I won't put it here. What I will tell you is that 3 months after the anniversary, Everett moved into a rental apartment in Mooresville. He was still showing up to the contractor's site every morning. His calls to me became shorter and more infrequent, and the ones I did get were different in tone. Less from a man waiting to be helped, more from a man figuring something out. The last time he came to the house for dinner, he brought a 6-pack and a bag of groceries and offered to cook. Jo stood in the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed and watched him fumble through a recipe. And I watched her face and saw something I hadn't seen there in a long time, uncomplicated joy. Not the careful, maintained warmth she had kept in place for years when Sloan was in the room, just her face, relaxed, looking at her son. He isn't who I want him to be yet. I'm not sure he's who he wants to be yet, but he is, for the first time in a long time, becoming someone of his own construction. And I think that matters more than I know how to say. I want to finish with something I haven't told many people. The night of the anniversary, after all the guests had gone home and the venue staff had begun clearing tables, and Jo had changed out of her blue dress and was sitting in the car waiting for me, I stood alone in that ballroom for a few minutes. The chandeliers were still on. There were half-finished glasses of wine on tables, crumpled napkins, a child's crayon drawing left under one of the seats. The remnants of an evening that had been, in most of its hours, genuinely beautiful. I thought about my own father. He died when I was 26, before Everett was born, before the company became what it became. He worked in a textile mill for 31 years, never owned anything. His truck was second-hand. His boots were resold twice before he'd buy new ones. And he came home every Friday with a paycheck and set it on the kitchen table, and my mother paid the bills from it before he ever touched it. He was a man built entirely from effort. I used to think I wanted something better for my own son. Standing in that empty ballroom, I realized I had wanted something better, and I had delivered something worse. That's not a comfortable thing to carry, but I think it might be the most useful thing I've learned in 63 years, that love without challenge is not kindness. that a life without difficulty is not a gift, that my father's boots, resoled twice, were worth more than everything in that ballroom. I turned off the last light and went out to where my wife was waiting. She asked me what took so long. I said I was just thinking. She said, "About what?" I said, "About how much your father would have liked of that contractor in Mooresville." She laughed, which was the right sound to end the evening on. 38 years, and she still laughs at the right moments. That's the whole story. Or most of it. The parts that are still unfolding. My son out there somewhere figuring out how to be a man. The marriage I hope survives but cannot control. The relationship between a father and a child that has to be rebuilt from something more honest than what it was. Those parts aren't finished yet. But this part is. And it ended the way the best things in my life have always ended. With Joe beside me, the lights out behind us, and the road going forward. If you've been carrying something similar, a child you've given too much to, a relationship in your family that has cost someone their dignity, a moment where you stayed quiet when you should have spoken. I hope something in this story found you. Not to make you feel worse about it, just to remind you that it's not too late to do it differently. It wasn't for me. Thank you for listening. If this story meant something to you, I'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you have something on your mind, leave it in the comments. I do read them. I've had a lot of time to think about what that evening actually was. Not the drama of it, not the legal maneuvering, not even Sloane standing up in front of 240 people with a document she thought would change everything. When I strip all of that away, what I'm left with is something much quieter and much harder to sit with. A father seeing, clearly and finally, the direct result of his own choices. That's the part nobody tells you about being a parent. You think the consequences of how you raise a child will show up in their teenagers. Maybe a bad grade, a fight at school, something you can still correct. You don't expect to be 63 years old, sitting in a ballroom you rented for $40,000, watching the bill come due for decisions you made when your son was 8. I gave Everett everything because I could. That was my logic. I worked hard so he wouldn't have to struggle the way I did, and I told myself that was love. But there's a difference between love and removal of consequence, and I spent 30 years confusing the two. What I was actually doing, I can see it now, was building a man who had no idea what he was made of, because I never let him find out. And a man who doesn't know what he's made of is easy to steer. Sloane understood that instinctively. She didn't manufacture Everett's weakness. I handed it to her. That's not a comfortable thing to write. But I think the discomfort is exactly the point. There's something I've come to believe about the way actions and consequences move through a life, not in any mystical sense, just the plain mechanical truth that what you build quietly over years eventually becomes the room you're standing in. I built a son who couldn't protect his own mother at her anniversary dinner. Sloane built a plan that collapsed the moment it met preparation. Everett is now building something new, slowly, with his hands, in a city where nobody knows his last name and nobody is going to hand him anything. Every one of those outcomes grew directly from seeds that were planted years before that Saturday in April. What I want for Everett, what I think he's finally reaching for, on his own terms, is the 3 things I wish I had given him from the beginning. The first is character. The willingness to do the right thing when it costs you something, to stand beside the people who love you even when it's inconvenient, to be the kind of man who doesn't stare at a centerpiece while his mother sits in shock. The second is judgment, the hard-won ability to see people clearly, to understand what someone is actually doing beneath what they're saying, to not be managed. That one takes time, and it takes failure to develop properly. I didn't let him fail, so he never built it. He's building it now. The third is endurance, the knowledge in your bones that you can get through difficult things, that you can show up at a job site at 6 in the morning when you don't want to and do the work and go home and come back the next day. That knowledge doesn't come from being told you're capable. It only comes from finding out. Joe asked me recently if I think Everett will be okay. I told her what I believe, that the man who shows up to the contractor's yard in Mooresville at 6 in the morning 5 days a week is already more okay than the man who sat at that dinner table in April. Not fixed, not finished. but moving in the right direction under his own power, which is the only direction that means anything. That's enough for me. For now, it's enough.